Hey everyone, welcome to today's webcast dealing with the aftermath of modern ransomware. I'm your host, Microsoft MVP Nick Cavalancia, and we call this the gift that keeps on taking because there's a lot of instances today of ransomware attacks where you're not just attacked once, you're attacked more than once, and not necessarily by even the same threat group either. So before we get into today's discussion, let me go ahead and introduce our panel of experts. First up, we have Rick Vanover. He is the Senior Director of Product Strategy over at Veeam. Rick, thanks for joining me today. Glad you're here. We're also joined by Vince Wood. He's a senior recovery engineer with CyberFortress. Vince, glad you're here as well. Going to bring some real good practical, experience with you today. I'm glad you're going to join us.
Yep, glad to be here. Let's have some fun talking about the gift that keeps on taking.
Indeed. And also we've got Jonah May. He's product architect with CyberFortress and a Veeam Vanguard. Jonah, glad you're here as well. Again, some more practical experience we're hoping to get out of you today. So looking forward to hearing from you.
Always happy to be able to talk and have people listen to me.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. So today's format is more of a discussion. So there's not a death by PowerPoint here. I think we've got a total of maybe 4 or 5 slides in addition to the one you're currently looking at on the screen. So so don't be worried if the screen isn't advancing while we're having a bit of this sort of a panel discussion with the experts that are here. That's okay. You're not missing out on anything. It's just a very light on the deck and kind of more heavy on the conversation. I do have the Q&A box open in front of me for any of you that are interested in sort of participating in the panel discussion, as it were, today. You've got a comment, question, an anecdote, a thought, whatever it is, stick that in the Q&A box. We'll be happy to try to include you in on the discussion that we've got today as well. This webcast, of course, is being recorded. You will be sent a link to the recording via email after the webcast is over. So the place we're going to start is just looking at the aftermath of ransomware. What does that actually look like today? I'm a real big believer in using industry data to kind of establish what's going on. I'm also making the assumption that most of you have your heads down on strategic initiatives. You're worried about, in this case, things like backups, disaster recovery, worried about cybersecurity, and anything else that goes along with your job. And so you don't have a chance to read a lot of industry data that is created. So try to put a couple of really good stats up here. The first one we got comes from Coveware's quarterly ransomware report. And you see here that email remains the #1 attack vector in ransomware attacks. Reason why I bring that up is just purely the fact that endpoints are sort of it's like all roads lead to the endpoint. From one endpoint to another, you have lateral movement. The goal is, of course, to get to as many systems as possible. So these threat actors are very keenly aware of the fact that they're trying to gain access to your environments through email, trying to take advantage of as many endpoints as is possible. Second one here comes from IBM's cost of a data breach. Sort of an interesting stat here. You can see that there's an average of 219 days that it takes for an organization to just detect an email-based attack. That's why I wanted to have the very first stat in there as well, so you can kind of see for those specific types of attacks. Do the math. That's 7 months on the average that someone is sitting within a network, able to freely move around in stealth with no detection whatsoever. And you see also, in addition to that, another 80 days, another about 2.5 months just to contain that breach. So it's a long time. You obviously want to, that's a lot of damage that can be done. You're giving those people plenty of a rope to figure out what they can do within the organization, what data they can access, that sort of thing. The next one I've got here actually comes from Comparetext Ransomware Analysis Report here. You see the average downtime duration, still about 3 weeks. It's measured in sort of weeks/days, if you will, but certainly not months, but it's not singular amounts of days. It's multiple weeks. And we saw that there's a lot of news articles that came out probably more so in 2020 and into 2021, where there was always this sort of so-and-so's been out of business for 3 weeks, or there's a certain government entity that hasn't even gotten back up on their feet in this many months. And we don't hear about the duration as much anymore. So it's nice to hear those stats and realizing that this is really a problem. And then the last one here I've got is from Cyber Reasons Ransomware, the true cost to business report here. And you can see here that 54% of victims end up still having corrupted systems or data even after paying the ransom. And so that's kind of a big problem here. And then there's another one that I also have here, which is, and I don't have it. Oh, I do have it on this slide. There we go. It's this one here. I didn't see the right side. And you see, this is important here. A majority of victim organizations, 80%, end up experiencing a second attack. It might be from the same threat group. It might actually be from a different threat group. There was an example not more than maybe 4 months ago of Conti ransomware, which has been very prevalent over the last year or so. Had actually partnered up with a data extortion group called Caracut. And what Conti would do is they would infect the victim organization, they would take them for whatever they could, and then they just sold the access to Caracut. Those organizations came up with an agreement, and then Caracut would hit them and say, we stole more data than Conti did, and we're going to publish it. And the whole sort of extortion game that goes on with ransomware as well. So this is sort of very, very prevalent. This is sort of what gives you a good idea of what it looks like. Vince, I want to start with you if I can. I got some questions written down here. And maybe just sort of a practical approach here. When you're working with customers that have just faced some kind of ransomware attack and they're sort of feeling the aftermath, what's the most immediate impact that you see with customers?
Oh man, that's an easy question. Having been in a sysadmin insider, role, the first thing that happens is just complete panic. You're sitting there, you're doing your day job, whatever, and all of a sudden, 3 C-level executives show up at your desk, your boss, a middle manager, and 2 users, and they're all yelling at you. The system is down, and you don't even know what happened.
Now that makes good sense, despite the fact of having hopefully good incident response plans or having a disaster recovery plan, those kinds of things in play. That panic does take over, probably just purely because of the fact that there's that uncertainty. This isn't like a location went down or server 5 went down. There's been an attack, and then there's this question of what's the scope, how bad is it, how much is it going to impact product, our operations. So that's not surprising. Rick, so besides things like the obvious encryption of data, which we're assuming happens with ransomware attacks in most cases, what else are you seeing happen with customers?
Well, there are 2 examples I'll bring up to share, Nick. The first of them is a blanket statement where these threat actors will do everything they can to kind of force the behavior of payment. Example, I was briefed of one situation where, like you say, they sit and they assess and they dwell with some of these numbers, and these numbers match some of the other resources I've read and the situations I've debriefed on. But one example was the threat actors took over the network printers and were printing out the ransom note to kind of get the user body engaged in the scare tactic, right? So that was one particular thing. And then the other thing, which sits really in the middle here of, the second bullet point, the 219 days to detect and 79 days to contain. A lot of times the strike moment is at the worst time, right before a holiday, right before a big milestone of an organization, because these threat actors are dwelling or assessing. They're going to try to pick the right time to force the behavior in their interest, right? So the discovery that goes on here is truly incredible sometimes. But I was briefed of one scenario that the incident struck the day before they were to host a political during the campaigns of the elections, right before one of those. Okay, so worst possible time, biggest possible stage for that organization. Same thing with the printers, again, taking over the fear to spread throughout the organization, right? Because a lot of times the information flow gets real tight. Vince's scenario of couple management, and the discovery from an end user, they don't want that information propagating. Right. So again, these different tactics that are in use will really try to force the behavior of payment. Right. So those are just a couple of observations I'll share to that.
It's interesting. There's even some other examples of, I want to say it was Conti, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was like Ryuk or something, but that actually started to offer a service as an additional cost. Now, maybe it was Conti, I think, because the ransomware is a service there. Additional service where after the affiliate had finished the attack, the service that was extra that was being offered was, we'll call all their contractors and their customers, and and PR and the press and anything like that. Just again, your same point, the end game being, let's try to make sure and encourage as much as possible getting that ransom paid. And on that same note of doing discovery, there have been instances where in the communication between the ransomware actors and the victim organization is when the ransom has been stated, okay, you've got to pay us $4 million. And then, of course, the response is going to be like, we don't have $4 million to give you. They've already done their diligence. It's like, actually, you're getting a check on Friday from such and such a company to the tune of $5.8 million. You can definitely afford the $4 million, or, that kind of scenario. And so they're definitely doing their diligence. And, you mentioned the discovery effort. It's massive. In fact, in some cases, I feel like it's probably much, much larger than the actual act of just encrypting everything and then communicating out to start getting the ransom paid. Jonah, anything to add to what we've been talking about today, just in terms of the aftermath and what else goes wrong?
The only thing I'll say is it seems like year over year, these numbers seem to be growing worse. Longer downtimes, longer times between penetration and actual ransom in order to mitigate some customers leveraging long-term backups, or even the increase in number of customers that get hit twice within a 30-day period.
It's definitely getting worse. On the note of the speed of attack, there is a stat from, I'm going to go blank on the source. It'll come to me at some point. I'll just yell it out randomly in the middle of the webinar while we're doing this today. But the average breakout time, which is basically from the compromise of the initial endpoint to their first lateral movement, on the average is 1 hour and 38 minutes. That's pretty fast. And then there's a ransomware group, Pop MC, I think, or MC Pop, I think that's the name of it. I might have that wrong a little bit, but their speed of time from initial compromise that gave them a foothold to actually fully encrypting the environment was less than 30 minutes, which is why they got the name Pop. It was like just super fast. So yeah, the speed is definitely moving up. This is something that is very problematic here. Let's talk a little bit about where the audience's data protection strategy may not be entirely up to speed, and which is our goal is, of course, to help them and that sort of thing. The goal for all of you in the audience should be not just, can I recover? It's actually to be resilient. And I went and grabbed a quick sort of definition of resilience here. And you can see here, it does just say to recover quickly. But the reality for us, when we talk about resilience and business resilience, we talk about it from a data protection standpoint, or even a cybersecurity standpoint. We're talking about like snapping back very, very quickly. We're talking in terms of minutes, not hours, not days, certainly not weeks, but minutes, bouncing back and being fully operational, that quickly. That's really what resilience is about, is in the face of this, the term that's used here in the definition is difficulty, but in terms of this disruption that happens to be a cyber attack, the ability to get back and operational, not just recover your data, like, whatever they encrypted, we recovered. That's part of it. It's actually about getting operational again. And, you can say, well, we've got our backups, so we recovered. That's not what resilience is about. Resilience isn't about what data do you have protected. Oh, that's a component. That's not solely what it's about. I mean, the reality here, it's about actually the goal and how do you get there. And so the idea here is you're thinking about what needs to be back up and operational, and in how long a time. The folks at Veeam, I know Rick and I have done some webcasts before, and we always talk sometimes about the gap that might exist between what your business goal is. Like, we need to get back up and operating within 15 minutes. And then you look at what the services and the hardware that you have in place and that sort of thing, and the solutions, and what they can accomplish. In the middle of sort of the availability gap. And that's what's going to define how resilient you can be. If you have a very large gap, you're going to have to address that. As a matter of fact, Rick, I'm going to ask you the first question on this topic here a little bit is, what are some of the aspects of a data protection strategy that you feel aren't really aligned in most organizations in order to achieve resilience?
Well, sure, Nick. So the first thing that comes to mind is really when you think about some of the threats. Veeam has some upcoming research that we're going to publish, but even last year's version of the market research data indicate that a cybersecurity incident or ransomware incident, by the numbers, is the type of incident, the type of disaster that organizations are much more likely to incur compared to the traditional thought of fire, flood, and blood and things like that.
Mhm.
So the thought here is that if you think about that as the first, most likely scenario of an incident, what we're seeing is that the nature of these types of incidents challenge the resilience models that were built. So to your point, sure, we have backups of everything, but when a cybersecurity incident happens, and this isn't, this is actually very defensible in the market, a lot of times a cybersecurity organization internally to a company will take over the response, and they may involve external, like law enforcement, root cause analysis. And so if you would imagine this like yellow police tape around where the data came from, well, I have my backup data, but you can't go back there. Okay, so this is one of the challenges of the status quo that happen when some of these incidents occur. And so what I'm seeing is the best practice that's emerging from the worst practice, especially when you mentioned that it takes 22 days in some data points to recover. That's because they have to wait for that root cause to sort out. So the best practice that emerged from the worst practice is to prepare to mobilize the data. And so what I say that you want to restore elsewhere, not because you want to, but because you have to. That's where Veeam has some data indicating that it's really surprising how many people actually decide, okay, today is the day that we're going to move to a hosted infrastructure. Today is the day we're going to move to the cloud, not because we want to, but because we have to. And I think having data portability as part of the mobilization, if needed, is a really mature aspect of the resiliency conversation, because I'll go one step further. If people make that decision, then they mess up in this area. They haven't thought about security. They haven't thought about networking in order to do that. I mean, the good thing about Veeam's backups is they're portable and they're self-describing, and we have partnerships built into our DNA across the public cloud, service providers, all the major on-premises platforms. We can change the platform if we need to, but you almost have to be ready and have it kind of on the forethought of how we're going to go into these types of changes. And I think this is actually, I'll go one step further, Nick, and I'll say that this is the area that all the backup products in the market agree upon. If something like a ransomware incident encrypts or destroys your data, the only option is to recover the data. All of my competitors have to agree with that. And if they don't, they're not doing the right service for the market. And so then when you think about, I have to recover the data, then the question of where do we put it comes in. And so that's my kind of resiliency soapbox moment to share with everybody.
Yeah, I'll add to that length. You mentioned the 22 days being a lot about things like root cause analysis. The other side that comes into play now for most of you in the audience is probably something around cyber insurance. And if you are involved at all in the planning of the cyber insurance you have, the policies that you have, you will know that the insurers do not want you to just recover over your let's say everything's on premises for the sake of argument, just recover over that same environment. And the reason is, in order for them, if there's going to be a claim made, they have to do some investigation to see whether or not you fit the model of the scenario that is covered in the policy, or did maybe you guys screw up and it's actually your own fault, and it doesn't, or maybe the issue at hand doesn't actually fall under the coverage of the policy. And so to Rick's point about maybe, now it's time, I guess we're moving to the cloud. Okay, let's do that. That might be another catalyst, Rick, is just the idea of, well, we can't recover if we're going to put a claim in. So at least not to our same infrastructure. We've got to go to some other alternative infrastructure. And so that happens as well. And that also tends to lengthen the process. Jonah, when you're engaging with customers and you're actually sort of designing and planning the recovery for each one of those, or you're performing the recovery for each one of those customers, what do they seem to be missing from their strategy and therefore from the execution?
The number one weak link that I see, because a data protection strategy, let's face it, is only as strong as the weakest link, the recovery environment not being properly segmented. Maybe the backup server is virtualized on your production cluster. So when your production cluster gets ransomed, so does the backup server, or it's joined to the Active Directory domain. So all the on-prem backups get encrypted. Or maybe you didn't properly even segment the disaster recovery cluster if you're hosting your own cluster, and maybe that got encrypted also as part of the attack. Another one I see, failback plans. We as a service provider see a lot of customers that want to test the backups, want to make sure everything works, want to prove that they can spin up in a proof of concept in our environment during a disaster. But what a lot of companies don't think about in that is, what does failing back look like? How do we take the change data in that environment and get it back on-prem or to wherever our new production infrastructure is going to end up? And finally, incident response plans. We see a lot of backup testing. What we don't see is tabletop simulations covering incident response. So kind of back to Vince's comment earlier about a user and several executives and a manager storming into an office and it frazzling the person in charge of backups. Do you have proper incident response teams? Are there designated people to give periodic updates to executives and end users? And what details should they share? How often will they share it? Who's going to be handling what tasks? Kind of like you and Rick were talking about in engaging your insurance vendors and your root cause analysis. Who's handling that? Who's taking touch points? Who's making sure all of that happens as seamlessly as possible behind the scenes? And equally so, does your incident response and recovery plans align with how you need to recover and get the environment back up, even if temporarily, to still meet your requirements for an insurance claim? Like you were talking about, not going back into that production cluster because it may need to be investigated by the root cause analysis or the claims company.
Yeah, that's good color. I appreciate that. That kind of adds a little more context to things we've already been talking about a little bit. Vince, anything that you'd add to this, just when you're talking to customers, you're dealing with them, again, whether it's planning or execution, where is their strategy lacking?
Well, I want to first say, I like that word that Jonah used, frazzled. I didn't think to use that word. I'm going to use that. But when it comes to resilience for a data protection strategy, the one thing that I've seen from experience that many are lacking is preparation on the front side. And what I mean by that is having appropriate documentation in place. How is everything configured now? What is the expected state of the environment now before the attack? Having monitoring in place such that when the expected state changes, that you know where you need to get back to, or where the expected functionality you need to restore. If you don't know what you had, how are you going to get back to that? How are you going to deal with the incident at hand? And then once you are in the middle of the incident, whether it's ransomware or something else, watching out for shadow IT that may pop up, because everyone knows that you have that Sally in sales. It's like, I need to get this email out to the customer right now. I'm going to miss this sale. And so they go about sending customer data, company data, however they can. And now it's left corporate environments. And so all of these things need to be thought of in advance, but also ensured that they are running and make sure they are accessible all along the way.
Yeah, I like that. You started off talking about having a plan. Jonah mentioned something as well, talking about the tabletop testing and that sort of thing. And I want to touch on a little bit of that on this last slide in our discussion today, and then we'll see if we've got some questions from you, those of you in the audience who want to talk, ask our experts and see what they think about it, and what's the best way to try and make sure we can help your organization. And a lot of this, Rick, I'm going to kind of go back to something you had mentioned. You talked about maybe it's time to move to the cloud. And of course, those in the audience should know at this point, there's a lot of opportunity to leverage the cloud to create not only a proactive plan and to respond to a ransomware attack in a way that allows you to remain operational, but actually gets this resilience, actually achieves that resilience. And that way, should ransomware be that sort of gift that keeps on taking, the reason why it keeps on taking, for the sake of argument, go back to my example of Conti and Caracut. The reason why that exists is because the environment was maybe returned to an operational state, but wasn't returned to what I call a known secure state. And what I mean by that is if they compromised endpoints, you can't just remove what you think is the malware that was on that endpoint. You may have to wipe those endpoints and start off from scratch. You may have to wipe a whole bunch of other systems. If someone even moved laterally through a system, you may have to recover that just to make sure that it's back to a known secure state, and then bring the data forward to an operational state that's current. So there's a lot of work there, and the cloud can actually help from a couple of perspectives. The backups themselves, of course, just the fact that you've got access to the backups, so you have the ability to put it up to the cloud, as opposed to whether you have your own hardware and infrastructure up and running or has a problem. Maybe it's part of the actual attack itself. The immutability that exists today, almost every single backup vendor, if they've worth their weight at all, they now have immutable backups to make sure that they can't be modified, can't be destroyed, that sort of thing. That way they're accessible. That goes back to the first one. And then the durability there is just always there to make sure that you know that the data is not being corrupted on its own. It's going to make sure that it's in its right form to ensure that you can get back and operational. Then there's testing, and Jonah touched on this a little bit. He talked about tabletop testing. I'm a big fan of any kind of disaster recovery planning that there is at least some kind of full or partial simulation testing. So tabletop, if you're not familiar with this, I'm assuming most of you are, but if there's anybody that isn't, let me kind of level set here. Tabletop simulations is more of like, we've got the plan here. I've got my papers in front of me with the plan written on it, and we're going to read this together and go, okay, step one. And everyone involved is sitting at the table, go, step one, we're going to do X. And then someone says, well, I'll do this, and then I'll communicate with that person. And then people can start throwing some, well, what happens if this happens? And you're doing these sort of tabletop academic simulations, if you will. We're sort of thinking it through and walking through the process, but we're not actually doing anything. We're talking about simulation. We're really more talking about, we want to test it out, the actual recovery. So to like Rick's point of, well, you're going to recover maybe to an alternate infrastructure in the cloud, we should probably be doing that. Every 6 months, we should be testing out to see whether it's a partial, like some portions, some maybe it's Active Directory and a couple of very key servers, or it's everything. And that sort of testing, as well as the same process in recovery, kind of brings me down to sort of the second sub word or bullet, if you will, here under recovery, which is the idea of having orchestration, where you have this automation. You've got it defined, what has to be recovered first, what has to be recovered second. You're thinking about dependencies, and you're automating this. You're structuring it, almost scripting it out, if you will, so that if you have to do a full recovery or a full simulation, it's not something where you're going, we have to spend 4 weeks preparing it. No, you should be able just to run the recovery, in essence, into a virtual environment and see if it recovers. I'm making it sound, very easy and painting a very rosy picture, but in concept, that's the idea here. And then the other part here, that just where the cloud comes into play, again, the accessibility, providing you with a recovery environment, and then failover, an ability to fail over to the cloud, which is what we talked about earlier. And then the last thing here is just thinking about what Rick said. This actually works out perfectly. Rick had found customers that just simply said, just move into the cloud. Just forget it. We'll just move up there. Let's start moving operations to the cloud. And that's that last part. You might actually just find you're better off doing it that way and running out of the cloud as opposed to not. So Rick, let me start with you. This is obviously not an exhaustive list. I pulled some things up that make a lot of sense to the idea of being resilient, did have to do with ransomware attacks and need to recover from them and that sort of thing. But where else do you see the cloud benefiting our audience when they're trying to achieve that goal of resilience?
Yeah, I do think this is a great starting list of major categories, but I think it's also worth a little bit of definition. So I know the last one, we had the virtual definition of resilience. I would challenge that we need to somewhat define cloud. It's not always something that starts with A. I'll die on this hill that the cloud is actually a model. It is not a location. It is elastic. It is billing, self-service, things like that. Doesn't have to be the hyperscalers, right? So I think that's a very, very important thing, because I have plenty of evidence of lift and shift to the hyperscale public clouds not actually ending so well. Okay, I've talked to a lot of organizations that have got into repatriation, things like that, on-prem. So I want to kind of preface this resiliency conversation to the cloud that this is a really good point around, what I think infrastructure as a service really is. And again, it doesn't have to always be a hyperscale public cloud, right? So that being said, these are very important good things. And I live in a world, I see a lot of customers that are going down this hybrid approach. And this fundamental question of what's the right platform for a workload should be asked, right? And like I was saying, lift and shift doesn't always have a fairy tale ending. So I think to the specific point of what is the resilience level in the cloud, it's really the ability to do all these things. And what I mean by that is you don't want to like change platforms and remove 3 or 4 of these things, right? Because that kind of misses the mark, or actually 1 or 2 for that matter. It kind of misses the mark of the resilience, right? So if you think about the data in the systems and the platforms you have, if you think about the needs that your organization has, if you think about the capabilities of the source and the target platforms, as long as the resilience conversation can be met across, then go for it. The one thing I would challenge, and this is something I'm in my 12th year at Veeam, and I've been saying this the whole time. It's changed over the years with, slight adjustments, but I'd say sometimes the resilience conversation is the, I don't want to say the ammunition, but like the justification. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the resilience conversation is the justification to change a platform. Maybe that is the things that are needed to get this last bit virtualized, because if we're virtualized, we can have these type of conversations on other platforms. Maybe the resilience conversation is worth getting off of this bizarre platform that only works on that dark thing in the corner, right? So to end it up with kind of a cheeky comment, sometimes the juice is worth the squeeze. The hard work to change the platform to get an outcome like this with the data points we've had, I'd rather get on the front side of it. And sometimes cloud and service provider models are the way to really handle these type of incidents that we don't always know what we're going to get.
You can appreciate if your entire environment is down because everything's encrypted. You got to start from scratch anyway. So you might go, I might as well just move to the cloud. So it makes perfect sense. To add to the sort of the list of what helps with resilience here, Joseph and the audience actually mentioned having runbooks in place to mitigate personnel issues in case those people are unavailable during a disaster. And I worked at an organization, and we had the what we called the nuclear football. And it was and it's basically just everyone had a blue book that matched, and it was exactly what you're talking about. And it was the disaster recovery plan. I live in Florida. We have hurricanes. We just had one come through. Didn't actually hit where I live, but it did actually just decimate the west side of Florida. They're talking like 5 years till that entire economy comes back. It's huge. And so having that's a great suggestion there, Joseph. Vince, let me ask you real quick. What would be one thing that you would recommend, or maybe you do recommend to customers that are trying to be resilient? And then just to kind of tee this up, Rick, I'm going to ask you the same question, and Jonah, I'm going to ask you guys the same question. So Vince, you're in the hot spot. You got to come up with an answer quick. But the other two, I'm prepping you and ask you for the same thing. So Vince, what would you recommend to customers, or what do you recommend to customers that are trying to be resilient? Give me one thing.
Well, we talked earlier about having preparation in place in advance, having that documentation in place. The one thing that I've seen multiple times when working with customers is the fact that it's not available. In other words, the ransomware incident took away that documentation. So, isn't that right? The best part is going to be making sure that documentation and that information is available.
That makes perfect sense. Rick, what's one thing either you do or you would recommend to customers that try to be resilient?
Ensure you have a absolute copy of your data. So, and that implies immutable, that implies offsite, that implies other types. I made up a word called ultra resilient, which could be immutable. It could be on tape. Some of these fancy schmancy storage arrays can do some things, right? Whatever you would bank your job and your business on, some copy that is that strong, that's my one piece of advice, because then I'm thinking all the other things of restoring somewhere else and ensuring I have ways to ensure it hasn't been tampered with, a data quality conversation, those types of things. So like, ensuring absolute portability and absolutely recoverable copy of data.
Love that. I'm gonna throw a question from the audience at you, Rick, because you just are talking about it anyways. And Greg's asking about an example of how immutability gets implemented. And you've talked about some storage arrays, and I know what the answer is, but I thought maybe once you go down that path a little bit, just talk about either how Veeam does it or if it's just based on storage. But you give us some examples of how immutability gets achieved.
All right, Greg, I'm gonna throw down here for you. I love the question. I don't know your environment, but not knowing much, this would be my blanket recommendation. It's baseball playoff season. I'm going to throw you double play immutability. So my first recommendation is your on-premises copy of backup data be on the Veeam hardened repository. It's any Linux system, bring your own hardware and put your first copy of backups there with the immutable attributes that Veeam writes. Then I have nothing but evidence of bad things happening to good data and fire, flood, and blood and all these other things. You want a copy offsite. So then I'd recommend your offsite copy be hosted in Cloud Connect backup with insider protection, and Vince and Jonah can help you with that. And the thought here is that copy of data is also, it's not immutable per se, but it is ultra resilient. Cloud Connect backup with insider protection requires 4 eyes recovery. So the threat actor, the tenant cannot see that kind of other copy of the data. So that is a 3-2-1 rule built with the offsite copy and the on-premises copy of backup data, ultra resilient. And by the numbers, I feel that is a very resilient copy of data strategy that isn't copies everywhere. It's the basic 3-2-1 rule with something offsite, but both of those other copies are ultra resilient. So there you go.
Wonderful. And then Jonah, going back to the original question that I was sort of passing around. I take that back. I'll stick with you, Jonah. What's that one thing you'd recommend to a customer that's wanting to make sure that their operation is resilient? What would you normally recommend?
I would recommend that you make sure you're using Veeam to its fullest extent. When it's deployed properly, for lack of a better analogy, Veeam fights for the user. So are you using those hardened Linux repositories and ransomware insider protection Rick mentioned? Have you deployed Veeam 1 in order to put in place some of the monitoring that Vince has talked about and other reports, such as some ransomware alarms and protection reports where you can find VMs that have maybe been missed? Are you leveraging Disaster Recovery Orchestrator to help automate some of your DR planning processes on premises and give some faster recovery if those backups are still accessible on-prem? There's a lot of tools in the Veeam availability suite, and it seems like many customers just settle for backup and replication and don't take it a step further. And I'll just build on one other thing Vince said earlier too. He mentioned documentation being accessible. Another big one I've seen also is not just documentation, but encryption passwords. I've seen several customers where they take their Veeam backups, they set an encryption password on it, they put it in a password vault, which is great, except the password vault is on premises and gets encrypted, and then they can't find their encryption password.
Makes good sense there. Let's do this because we don't really have any sort of promotional aspect to this webinar. This is just purely educational. But I did want to give each of you an opportunity just to talk a little bit about how your organizations can help our audience achieve a state of resilience. And so, Rick, can I start with you? Sort of, you get here's your 30 seconds to promote. You doesn't have to take 30 seconds, but to kind of self-promote, talk about how Veeam can help, that sort of thing. And then Jonah and Vince, I'm going to end up asking each of you as well. So Rick, what would you tell the audience? How does Veeam help them achieve resilience?
Well, the most primitive part of that is that absolute copy of data. And then to Greg's point, I hope everyone can see it in the questions. I wrote a blog once I explain it 4 times, I got to write it up. Okay. So the thought here is I wrote that up. I shared a few models, and so I'd encourage everyone to check that out over at the Veeam Community Hub. So my thought is have that absolute copy of data. And then the other kind of important thing is, believe it or not, I'd say it's almost non-technical. Invest in user training, because so many incidents, when you go to the root cause, back to the data point, starts with email. I'm not saying everybody don't use email, even though that sounds wonderful. But I'm saying invest in user training, because the human element is the human firewall. We probably all heard that term. That is probably the most effective investment to prevent an issue from happening. I'm in the business of, okay, it's happened. We got to get this data back. You know, Veeam's a backup provider. We can't cut it off at the front. No backup provider can. Be very cautious on that. But the users can. You know, if we implement remote access in a good way, which we should be doing anyways, if we do updates on things, which we should be doing anyways, and then if we also train our users, those 3 modes right there can cut off a good 90% of all incidents. The Coveware, the CrowdStrike reports, the Veeam reports that we've done on ransomware and cybersecurity, one of those 3 things actually paved the way for the other. The phish email uses remote access done wrong. The update not being applied enabled remote access to be exploited, things like that. Those are the words to live by, in my opinion.
I just saw your blog there. And by the way, CrowdStrike was where I got that hour and 38 minutes. I couldn't think of CrowdStrike, but I was going to yell.
I read it too. And if
yeah,
we all should be reading those for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. So Jonah, kind of the same question. You talk a little bit about CyberFortress and how they're helping businesses achieve resilience.
Right, so we've touched on some of it a little bit already. We've talked about insider protection. Obviously, with Cloud Connect, we can recover you back using both Cloud Connect backup and Cloud Connect replication. And equally so, I've at least touched a lot on some of the on-prem stuff, Veeam One Disaster Recovery Orchestrator, and we do have partners that we can link you up with that can help you perform on-premises assessments, maybe help you implement some of those tools or Linux hardened repos, check some of your security best practices to make sure that your on-premises environment is as hardened as it can be. Because honestly, as a cloud provider, my hope at the end of the day is you pay me for services and never have to use me. In a perfect world, you never have to touch your cloud backups, because if something happens, your on-prem backups are always usable, and those are your first line of defense.
And Vince, what would you add to that in terms of how CyberFortress helps achieve resilience?
Easy. Test your backups. This can be in part or in whole. This can be once a year or multiple times a year. The more, the better. As Rick said, you know, involving the human aspect of it. Work through your IR plans, your tabletops that Jonah mentioned, but test your backups. Because once you test them and you verify that what you expect to be there is actually there and it does function, then you can go to the cloud if you need to. You have trust in what you've set up.
Excellent. So let's do this. Let's actually go to some questions here. There's a QR code here for those who wanted to find out more information from CyberFortress. We'll just leave this up here while we do Q&A. And I got a couple of questions here. And this might be one for you to find something, Rick, and then paste it here to everybody. But Ryan's asking about there's some generic network segmentation and mutability guidance on Veeam's site, but it's difficult to translate some of that into effective implementations. You're sort of like taking it into something that's practical guidance. Do you have any reference implementation docs? So maybe you can find something while we're doing this, but I want to make sure that question got read.
Well,
Nick, do you have any answer? Go ahead.
Yeah, I gotta caution Ryan on that one. It gets real specific real quick there. And that's where I think, you know, if I am a server admin, storage admin, network admin, site reliability engineer, whatever, platform ops, whatever the new titles are, I can go through Veeam documentation and look through all the ports and, you know, this is what is required. And so at a minimum, go through like explicit minimum credentials and, you know, micro segmentation of ports and firewalls, and then not giving everything internet access. Ryan, that's my blanket recommendation. But I really think if you want to do the next level and such, you know, seek help. You know, Jonah said he has some referrals he can make about individuals who do this every day, right? These are the experts that, you know, when they look in a good way, look at what you have and say, okay, this is probably a recommendation that I've seen that we could do something more resilient here. It gets real specific real quick, and I think you would need some help there.
Excellent. There's a question from an anonymous attendee. Any real examples of a successful immutable recovery from ransomware, and what was the RPO and RTO attained? And anybody have an example of that? You have to name the customer, of course, but do you have an example of successful immutable recovery from ransomware and the RTOs and RPOs achieved?
Every day. I talked to our support team about that. I'll summarize one of them, and it actually could have been ugly. I'll be very clear on it because there was a training issue. They didn't know everything that the Veeam stack that they had could do. Short story, threat actor knocked out everything, and including the backups. They didn't do the 3-2-1 rule, didn't have anything immutable. Snap, that sounds like a bad day. Production and backup. So every worst practice was followed. Internet connectivity, same password for everything, only one copy of backup data. Everything you could have drawn up was wrong. The RPO and RTO was great because it was actually kind of a joke because they're on the phone with our support organization and they're like going through their checklist of what they have. And they said, what kind of primary storage do they have? And the customer, put the phone on his jacket and said over to the storage admin, hey, what are we using for storage? And they shouted out a brand and relayed that back to our support team. And he said, are you using the integration? And the customer said, what's that? Okay, so it was a training issue, but then they were able to do Veeam Explorer for storage snapshots and instantly recover everything in minutes. So this stuff happens. We see very high success rates especially when people follow the best practices. Now that would involve some luck, which you don't want to have that. But yeah, I see good endings to that all the time when I talk to our support team, because I pivot my advice. I hear, okay, what works, but I listen really closely at what doesn't work. And that's what goes out to my advice.
There's another question came in about what percentage of ransomware victims pay the ransom. I haven't seen any data of late. Rick, do you guys have anything?
Yeah, the last year Veeam ransomware trends report. I'm going to pull this up because Veeam's actually done some market research in here, and I should be really, really clear on this. This is not a Veeam customer survey. We've surveyed the world across all IT leaders that may or may not be Veeam users. So we had data indicating, this was the ransomware data protection trends report 2022. You can go to vee.am/DPR22. And the question was, did you pay the ransom to recover your data? 52% said that they did pay the ransom and that recovered their data, but 24% said they did pay the ransom, but it did not lead to a successful data recovery. That is 76% of people paying the ransom, with approximately 1/3 of those not able to recover. So that is a data point telling me, Nick, do not pay the ransom. That is not a Veeam customer survey. That is market data that we used an external survey house to get. So be very clear on that.
Wonderful. So another question came in from an anonymous attendee. Excuse me. Should we be concerned with supply chain cyber attacks, which may compromise the data protection vendor themselves and consequently their customers? And obviously, I'm going to throw this to you, Rick, only because they're talking about vendors like you. And you don't have to answer specifically for Veeam, although I know you will. But what's your thought about? I mean, in general, I would tell you should always be worried about your supply chain. I mean, every vendor that has any kind of access to your entire environment, et cetera, et cetera. But
I'll give a different view. I'll give you a different view. I mean, the supply chain means a lot of things, but the first thing I'll say is that sometimes you can't get parts now. So there's that supply chain problem. And so you might, again, need to go somewhere else, not because you want to, but because you have to. But, Mr. Vince has got a point of view here too. I'd be real curious to his.
Yeah, with regards to supply chain, you can interchange that word with anyone else involved in your big picture. And the answer is yes, because you need to go back and test, okay, production's gone for whatever reason. We need to bring up this business somewhere else. So you need to know every component in the chain, is it still good? So if that's a monitoring tool, if that's a documentation tool, a data protection tool, whatever you're using, the whole thing needs to work. And if you have a break in the chain, what good is your strategy? What good is your IR planning. All the things matter.
Wonderful. And then one last comment came back in from Ryan, who was asking about the reference guide. Just to totally understand it's specific to the environment. It did mention to be helpful to have a reference guide to put meat on the bones for the generic guidance. So maybe that's a future Veeam doc, or maybe you have a little homework you could try to see if something exists. But it looks like we're at the end of our questions. I'm going to sort of slowly get us towards where we're going to end this in case somebody's typing a question right now. I want to make sure you have a chance to get that question answered because we do have a few minutes left. It's about 8 minutes before the hour, and do want to make sure everyone has a chance here. So let's do this. While we're waiting here, Jonah, let me start with you. Just final thought. Just final thought to sum up everything that you think the audience should walk away from as they're thinking about trying to ensure resilience in the face of ransomware.
Final thoughts would be resilience is a tough beast to tackle, especially with Veeam. There's a lot of moving pieces, and sometimes it can be hard to get the approvals to enlist outside help, but there's a reason that there's Vanguards and Veeam certified engineers and architects and partners, because they do this every day for a living and they may think about things that you might not. So where possible, I'd say engage outside help.
Wonderful. Vince, final thoughts?
My final thought would be, in everything you're doing when it comes to data protection, think big picture. Think high level. What is your boss going to ask? What is your C-level going to ask? What is your network engineer going to ask? Think big picture.
And Rick, final thoughts?
Oh, be prepared to mobilize. And what I mean by that is, like I said, today might be the day that you restore elsewhere. Today might be the day that we, change platforms, not because we want to, but because we have to. And just kind of going in with that being an option, go through the drill. What security, what networking, what storage, what permissions are needed to make that work? Because that time is an investment now that'll save you the burden later.
Wonderful. Looks like it's got about 6 minutes left. So I think we're going to let class out early a little bit, give you guys a couple minutes of your day back. Just want to
I
thank,
did just want to
Rick.
jump in real quick.
Oh, good, Jonah.
Rick's
Okay,
comment and just say, kind of talking about that shifting workloads. I meant to mention this earlier. I have seen many a case where a customer has gone to perform a disaster recovery test with a cloud provider, and hypothetically, they're still using physical workloads, and kind of seeing the options available to them in restoring and recovering those physical workloads has been the shift and the catalyst that the IT division has been able to use to get those machines finally virtualized.
Perfect. Appreciate that as well. So Rick, Jonah, Vince, thank you guys for a great conversation today. This was obviously very interactive. Got a bunch of good customer questions from the audience, rather, that is. And just want to thank all you in the audience for attending today's webcast. Again, be sure to check out this QR code if you haven't already, or check out cyberfortress.com. Thanks for attending today's webcast. This is going to conclude the webcast. We'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks for attending.